Okay, today I am reviewing Agatha Christie's novel Appointment with Death, and there's a lot to say about this novel. It's another Poirot novel. It's another novel that is a foreign travel novel. This time, right after going to Egypt, presumably Poirot makes his way to Jerusalem in the Holy Land. And it's quite fitting that that this mystery takes place in the Holy Land because there are a lot of religious resonances going on in it. There are references to Judaism, to Christianity, to Islam, and to Buddhism. The story has a couple of quotes in the story are quite provocative, and in fact, the entire plot turns on these two. And the first one is the very first sentence of the novels. This is the first sentence of Appointment with Death. You do see, don't you, that she's got to be killed. And this is a sentence that Poirot overhears from his hotel window in Jerusalem. So this rather provocative first quote is the way that the story opens, and it's spoken by a member of this family, and the family, their last name is Boynton, and the Boynton family is kind of the center, create the center of this novel, and at the very center of the family is Mrs. Boynton, who's the matriarch. This woman, to call her a bitch is to put it mildly, this woman is a sadist. She rules her family with an iron fist. She has 3 stepchildren and 1 biological daughter who all live with her. The oldest son, Lennox, is married to a woman named Nadine. The next 2 are Raymond and Carol, and then there's Ginny, who is her biological daughter. These people are petrified to act outside of their mother's wishes, so they have no contact with the outside world, and she just enjoys the feeling she gets from dominating these people, particularly her oldest son. So she gets them to try and think about leaving her or getting away from her, but she rules them with such an iron fist, and they have really no resources outside of her, so they're stuck with it. And this comes after years and years of psychological torture, is what it really amounts to. And so obviously in this first sentence, you do see, don't you, that she has to be killed. We have 2 children discussing and plotting even their mother's death. Now, there are some other characters in this story. We have Mrs. King, Miss King, Sarah King. She's a young woman who's recently become a doctor. There's also a Dr. Gerard. And then there's Lady Westholm, a British woman. And we also have her companion, Miss Pierce, another British lady who's rather dithery. Now, Sarah King falls in love with Mrs. Boynton's second son, Raymond, and he with her. And she decides she's going to do something about this because she does not like this woman. And she goes over to her and tells her that she thinks she's a pathetic woman who has nothing better to do than just to simply dominate people. And Mrs. Boynton's response is the second important quotation in this novel. She looks, and I'll just set it up for you. Sarah says, "Go on, say it. It doesn't matter what you say to me, but think over what I've said to you." The words came at last in a soft, husky, but penetrating voice. Mrs. Boynton's basilisk eyes looked, not at Sarah, but oddly over her shoulder. She seemed to address not Sarah, but some familiar spirit. "I never forget," she said. "Remember that. I've never forgotten anything. Not an action, not a name, not a face." There was nothing in the words themselves, but the venom with which they were spoken made Sarah retreat a step. This, this quotation by Mrs. Boynton becomes one of the more important clues of the novel, and you'll have to read it to find out why. The family end up, all of the travelers, in fact, end up at Petra, the Rose Red City. You may have seen it if you've seen Indiana Jones. And Mrs. Boynton sends all of her family off to do some sightseeing one day, and she sits outside of her cave in a chair, immobile, and she's described as kind of a large Buddha. and she just sits there. And in turn, almost every character comes up to her and has some kind of interaction with her. But by 6 o'clock, when a servant goes to get her for dinner, she's found to be dead. The novel itself is very interesting because Mrs. Boynton is a sacrificial character. Sarah King talks about the idea of sacrifice. They're at an old an area or an excavation that was an old kind of a mount of sacrifice, and she was talking about how sacrifice could be good if it benefits others. So one person dies for the benefit of others, not quite like a Christ type image where we have a good person, an innocent person dying for the benefit of others, but in this case we have someone who's causing a great deal of pain to other people dying. Okay, so the psychological moment. In this novel, Mrs. Boynton is the one who has a psychological moment when she is talking seemingly to Sarah King, but is kind of looking off into La La Land and talking about never forgetting a face or a name. She has a moment where she's confronted by something and also remembers something. So these psychological moments are often kind of points where people gain a deeper level of understanding. I think the other thing, one of the themes in the story is domination, and Christie describes it as possession, and she says that possession is one of the oldest instincts that we feel. It's a primordial sort of instinct, this desire to control and possess something. Certainly Mrs. Boynton is like that, and in this novel it's quite often the women who are dominating the men, because the men in the story have been emasculated by Mrs. Boynton. So Lennox is under his mother's thumb. His wife Nadine tries to get him to get away, and even tells him she's leaving him for another man to try and stir up this feeling of possession in him so that he'll go after her. Sarah King, in a way, dominates Raymond in her love for him and in her desire to see him escape his mother. So we have all of these. Lady Westholme dominates Miss Pierce, who's rather gullible. Now there's some frank talk about sex in the novel, as far as sex in terms of attraction, and this could get to that kind of primordial feeling of possession, and maybe sex does come down to possession, and certainly sex becomes an attraction for the young men, and actually it's kind of you can see it as a psychological motivator for these men to get out from under their mother's thumb. Now, Freud would probably have a heyday with this because we've got the domineering sort of Oedipal mother, we've got two sons, and they're not even real sons, they're stepsons, but they've grown up under this for so long and they don't feel like they can ever get out of it. The oldest son, Lennox, has completely given up, and it takes the possibility that his wife will be with another man to get him to act. For Raymond, it takes the attraction he feels for Sarah King in order to get him to act. And so here you also have maybe some resonances, and maybe this is kind of a prelude to what Hitchcock is going to explore in Psycho, with Norman Bates feeling attraction but feeling dominated by his mother. And really these characters are almost as stunted as a Norman Bates type character, not to the point of being psychotic, but they're pretty desperate. The novel, I think, is a pretty strong novel. It's got a pretty long denouement where Poirot explains everything, and it kind of needs it because it's kind of a complex situation by the ending. And it's one of those where Poirot maybe makes you think like 3 or 4 people could be the murderer before he finally reveals who the actual murderer is. The ending is rather conventional, you might even say a little bit sappy in its kind of approach to happiness, but then you can kind of forgive Christie on this because of what these characters have been through with this domineering, horrible frog toad of a woman. So I would give it, I think I would give it a 4.5 out of 5. It's really good.